Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the place where we do not merely brush the dust from ancient stones, but stand eye to eye with the forgotten rulers whose shadows stretch back to the dawn of civilization itself. Tonight, we slip far beneath the shifting sands of time, to an age before pyramids, before hieroglyphs covered temple walls, before the world knew the word pharaoh. We stand in the cradle of the Nile Valley at the threshold where legend becomes history, and meet a man whose name, scratched on fragments of pottery and scrawled on the oldest tombs of Abydos, may well be the oldest royal name we know. His name? Iry-Hor, a shadowy king, or perhaps a chieftain becoming a king, who walked the desert nearly 5,200 years ago, in the hazy dawn before the Pharaoh's line truly began. Who was he? What world did he inherit, and what did he build? How does a name, little more than a scratched falcon and a symbol, still whisper to us across 5 millennia? Sit back, pour yourself something warm, light a candle for the ancestors, and step with me into a time when the Nile was young, and so were the kings who first bent it to their will. To understand Iry-Hor's childhood, we must roll back the desert itself, see this land not as sand and ruin, but as the green lifeline it was at the very dawn of settled life. Picture it, my friends, the wide floodplain of the young Nile, long before pharaohs would raise obelisks to pierce the sun. Here, a boy was born to a world perched on the knife's edge between wilderness and order. He came into being in the late Predynastic Age, around 30,200 BCE. In his lifetime, the Nile's annual flood was not only a blessing, but a living god, a power that gave birth to harvests and could drown them just as easily if neglected. To be born into a ruling clan along its banks meant the river's moods were your inheritance and your burden. Iry-Hor's people did not yet carve towering statues or bury their dead in vast pyramids. Their homes were simple reed huts thatched with palm leaves, clustered in villages that dotted the black earth like beads along a string. Within these huts, children like Iry-Hor learned to fish with woven nets, to tend goats and cattle, and to plant barley and emmer wheat along the receding floodwaters. But for the children of chiefs, the sons of the men who controlled these precious banks, life was something different. Little Iry-Hor was not just any boy under the sun. He was born to observe, to lead, to learn the weight of command before he was old enough to lift a spear. Imagine him, a child watching his father settle quarrels over grazing rights, count jars of beer to pay laborers, or negotiate for exotic goods brought by traders drifting up from Nubia or down from the Delta marshes. He would have watched how power depended not just on muscle, but on alliances, marriages arranged, tribute promised, and the subtle dance of loyalty among early settlements. And above it all, there were the gods, or the first whisperings of them. Horus, the falcon god whose sharp eyes ruled the skies, was not yet the firmly enthroned patron of kingship he would later become. But already, his fierce gaze promised the link between the human ruler and the divine order. Ma'at, the fragile balance between flood and drought, life and death, chaos and civilization. A young Iry-Hor would have heard stories of Horus swooping down to protect the just and strike the rebel. In those stories, the seeds were sown for what he would become, a leader claiming the falcon's blessing, uniting scattered settlements under a single name scratched onto ivory labels, his name. His childhood was not gentle by our standards. The people of this world lived short, hard lives. Disease, hunger, wild animals, and neighboring raiders could sweep away whole villages. From his earliest days, Iry-Hor would have learned to fear famine, to respect the river's power, and to wield the club and mace to defend his clan's cattle and fields. It is here, in this narrow strip of fertile soil between desert and flood, that kingship was born, not from marble palaces or marble columns, but from a child's lessons in survival, stewardship, and strength. He learned to bind people together, to promise that through him the river's bounty would be shared, the floods managed, the herds protected, the ancestors honored. When we look back at Iry-Hor's earliest days, we see the outlines of something much bigger than one boy's life, the birth of an idea that a single figure, blessed by Horus, chosen by the ancestors, could stand between chaos and plenty, that he could be the first reed that bound many stalks into a single basket, a kingdom. So, my friends, the next time you see the Nile shimmering under the sun, Remember that long before pyramids rose to scrape the stars, there was a boy who stood on its banks dreaming of order, power, and the falcon's sharp cry overhead. The Nile's pulse set the drumbeat of Iry-Hor's rise as it had for countless generations before him, but never quite like this. By the time Iry-Hor came of age, the small clusters of huts had begun to weave into something more. Proto-towns strung like beads along the river's fertile banks. Villages traded fish for grain, hides for pottery, salt for incense, and above them all rose those few who could bend the river's gifts to their will. The first rulers, the first to gather tribute, protect storehouses, and levy labor to dig the earliest canals. Iry-Hor's world was not yet the stone-stacked majesty of the pyramids. No obelisks pierced the sky, no vast armies marched under a single banner. Power was fragile, a patchwork quilt stitched together by marriage, barter, raids, and the promise that one man could tame chaos long enough for the crops to grow. And Iry-Hor, if the scratched symbols in Abydos tell us anything, was such a man. His name appears on jars and seals unearthed from Tomb UJ at Abydos and from scattered sites reaching into the Nile Delta, hints that his influence stretched far beyond a single village. He likely rose to power not just through inheritance, but by forging alliances with neighboring chieftains and breaking those who refused to bend the knee. His rule was not some crown on a golden throne. Imagine instead a man standing at the front of cattle raids, leading a handful of loyal warriors armed with maces and flint-tipped spears. Picture him ordering the digging of channels to carry the Nile's sweet water deeper into the desert fringe, turning scrubland into grain fields, and tying the people's survival to him alone. Trade, too, was power. Early ivory tags and pottery fragments suggest contact with Nubia to the south, where gold, ivory, and incense could be coaxed from the wild lands beyond the first cataract. By controlling trade routes along the river, Iry-Hor could offer tribute, precious goods, or force to persuade neighboring clans to join his banner. And always above his name, the falcon, Horus. If we believe the serekh found carved with his name, Iry-Hor was among the first to link himself directly to this soaring god, a declaration that his right to rule was not only the power of his mace, but the blessing of the heavens themselves. This tiny leap from strong man to God's chosen was the first heartbeat of Egyptian kingship. We do not know if he raised armies in any form we'd recognize today, but we do know conflict shaped his reign. Skirmishes between Upper Egypt, the narrow stretch of Nile where Abydos lay, and the more marshy, chaotic Lower Egypt to the north were common. Each petty king who secured a stretch of river claimed new fishing pools, new pasture land, new tribute. Each conquest stitched a longer thread through the land that would one day become a single mighty tapestry. In Iry-Hor's lifetime, that unity was still a dream, fragile, contested, and far from complete. But he carried the dream forward. With every village brought under his sway, every rival chief forced to yield, every storehouse filled with surplus grain, he showed his people that a single leader could command not just loyalty, but destiny. When the floods came too high or too low, when famine or rivals threatened, they looked to him, the falcon's son, to set things right. In that fragile trust was the seed of something revolutionary. The idea that the king embodied the land, the river, the gods, and the people's future in one living being. He bent the river and the people with it, and in doing so, he carved the first rough channels for the vast empire to come. When Narmer later united Upper and Lower Egypt with the Double Crown, it was men like Iry-Hor who laid the bedrock, brick by humble brick, serekh by serekh, blood by blood. So tonight, when you think of the Nile winding through the desert like a serpent of green, remember that long before the pyramids rose on its banks, there were men who looked at its floods not with fear, but with purpose, and dared to harness its might for something bigger than any single harvest. All stories fade into the sand, but some leave a mark deep enough that time itself hesitates to erase it. For Iry-Hor, the final chapter of his life unfolded in the dry hills west of the Nile, where the black earth gave way to an unforgiving desert. Here, at a place the ancients called Tadjesser, the sacred land, rose Abydos, the oldest of Egypt's royal burial grounds. Long before Giza's pyramids crowned the horizon, before the Valley of the Kings hid its secrets in desert cliffs, Abydos was where kings and chieftains laid down to wait for eternity. We know little of how Iry-Hor died. There is no triumphal stela carved with his conquests. No funerary texts survive to tell of the day he left the world of the living. But the clues lie in the sand and mudbrick of his tomb, a pit cut into the desert plateau, modest by the standards of pharaohs to come, yet monumental for its day. Perhaps he died as so many did then, not by an assassin's hand or on a bloodied battlefield, but by a fever that no ritual could cure. Or old age, if he was lucky. A luxury in an age where 30 winters could feel like a lifetime. Maybe his last days were spent among his family, his trusted elders and warriors, beneath a simple thatched roof while the river he bent to his will kept on flowing, uncaring and eternal. When his breath finally stopped, a procession must have formed. Picture it, a line of mourners winding through the dawn mist, carrying pottery filled with beer, baskets of grain, finely flaked flint knives, precious beads, all offerings for the journey beyond. Perhaps they led cattle, goats, or even the loyal servants who, in these harsh early centuries, were sometimes sacrificed to follow their king into the afterlife. They laid him in tomb B1 or B2 at el-Ka'ab, the mother of pots, so named for the shards of offerings that still litter its dry sands. The tomb itself was simple, rectangular pits lined with mud brick, surrounded by shallow subsidiary graves. No soaring limestone facades yet. No golden funerary mask to gaze out from beneath linen wrappings. Only raw earth, ancient wood, and the belief that what you buried would accompany you forever. His name, Iry-Hor, was inked or scratched onto ivory labels and jar seals, marking his goods as royal property. This was the first flicker of a tradition that would blaze into the hieroglyphic art of later centuries. A falcon perched above his name on the serekh declared him not just a man, but a chosen vessel of Horus. Even in death, that bond between king and god was growing stronger, the roots deepening with each passing ruler. What did his people believe lay beyond the tomb? Their ideas of the afterlife were still unformed compared to the elaborate visions that came centuries later. But they knew the desert was not just emptiness, it was a gateway, a threshold. To lie at Abydos was to rest near the doorway of Osiris, the god who would one day rule the underworld. The seeds of that myth were already taking root in this dry plateau where the wind wails over scattered pottery shards. And so Iry-Hor, this shadow king, lay under the sands, his tomb marking one of humanity's first bold declarations that death was not the end but a new beginning, requiring tribute, offerings, and memory. Around him, the desert crept in year by year, century by century. Dynasties rose, fell, rose again. Pyramids clawed at the sky. Empires spread to Nubia and Syria, invaders came and went. Yet here, beneath the winds of el-Ka'ab, the first whispers of kingship endure. When later pharaohs, Narmer, Aha-Jer, rose to forge a unified Egypt, they buried themselves nearby, paying tribute to the old ground where men like Iry-Hor proved that a single leader could stand between chaos and order. They knew that every pyramid stood on the shoulders of these simple tombs cut into the desert, each serekh a promise that the line of kings would not break. And tonight, you and I stand at the edge of that grave in our minds, the wind howling over sun-baked sands, and speak his name once more. Iry-Hor. The first, or among the first, to claim that the Nile's gift and the people's faith could be bound together in the figure of a king. Long after his body crumbled to dust, the idea he embodied never died. So here we stand, my friends, at the shifting edge where sand meets memory, where stone meets story, and where a single scratched name on a broken shard can speak louder than the roar of armies long turned to dust. Tonight, we step back to the dawn, to a world before the pyramids, before hieroglyphs told tales on temple walls, before kings sat on gilded thrones beneath the burning sun. We walked beside a man whose name was never meant to echo down to us, yet does, faint but unbroken. Iry-Hor. Perhaps a shadowy king. Perhaps the first to wear the faint glimmer of a crown in a land learning to bind itself to the will of one. He did not build monuments the world would envy, yet he built the foundations upon which every pharaoh after him would stand. Narmer's unification, Djoser's step pyramid, Khufu's towering tomb of stone, Ramses' colossal statues gazing over the Nile, they all begin in some fragile way with Iry-Hor, and the people who believed that the flood could be commanded, the land defended, the chaos tamed. So the next time you stand in a museum's echoing hall, staring at a slab of cracked pottery marked with a tiny falcon and a simple name, remember the power of that mark. Remember that our stories are often written not by the grandest monuments, but by the people who dared to stand up first when the world was still a swirl of tribes and dreams and uncarved stone. Faces of History is about this. Not just the emperors whose marble likenesses loom large, or the conquerors whose banners streamed in desert winds, but the half-forgotten figures whose courage, cunning, and sheer will laid the bedrock for all that followed. Iry-Hor stands at our shoulder tonight to remind us that greatness often begins quietly. A boy at the riverbank, a man who held together a stretch of Nile long enough for his people to say, yes, this man rules because the gods favor him, because he brings the floods, because we trust his name to carry ours. 5,000 years later, here we are, still carrying that name. So tonight, pour one last cup for the ancestors. Let the candle burn down to its wick. Let the winds of Abydos stir your dreams, because tomorrow, when the sun rises, the river still runs and our stories still flow with it. This has been Faces of History. I am, as ever, your host, the Duke of New York. Until next time, my friends, keep your eyes on the horizon, your heart open to the past, and remember, some names, no matter how faintly carved, never truly vanish. Good night.